Well, just a short time ago, we were joined by the Greens leader, Bob Brown, who was in our Melbourne studio. Bob Brown, thanks for joining us.
Good evening, Tony.
Let's get your reaction first to this report saying the states will be up for $2.1 billion a year in extra costs, mostly due to higher electricity costs as a result of the federal government's carbon pollution reduction scheme.
Well, that's schools and hospitals that are going to be up for $2 billion extra, but they're not getting the compensation like the big polluters. Quite incredible, because what's on the line here is nurses' jobs, the salaried doctors' jobs, of course teachers' jobs, and a public education and health system that needs help much, much more than the big polluting companies, which are going to get $12 to $16 billion out of the Rudd government under their CPRS legislation.
Why has this just arisen now? I mean, for example, we got a response from Senator Wong's office tonight repeating that states and territories won't get compensation. They'll be expected to, quote, pass through costs, presumably to consumers, but they say those costs will be covered by the household assistance package.
Well, it's not true, you see, because these are costs that are going to the health and education system. So it either means that there has to be a cut in services there, potentially closure of schools and or hospitals, or or removal of staff, or increased costs in a system which is already very expensive to the public sector. It's been overlooked because the schools and the public health system haven't got near the lobbying power on Capitol Hill in Canberra with Senator Wong's office or the Prime Minister's office of the coal miners, the aluminium industry and the massive resource extraction industry, which is going to get the billions.
Well, the states have clearly got an obvious lobbying arm, and there's a COAG meeting tomorrow, for example. They're not saying that they're going to, at this stage, demand compensation, but they are pushing for compensation, it appears. How big an issue is this going to be?
Well, I think it should be huge, because the states also are under the thumb of the big resource extraction industries like the logging industry and the coal industry, but they have to stand up for their public health and education systems and transport and police stations, everybody who's going to be paying the extra money. And it is going to be an impost on them. The Commonwealth is going to raise the money and hand it back in billions to the big corporations. And if you look at the coal industry, for example, it's 75% owned outside Australia, or that's where its profits go. So the money will drain out of Australia instead of into public schools and hospitals. It is just not logical, it's not ethical, it's poor policy. And the Greens, of course, will be moving to amend that part of the legislation and make sure that the public health and education systems are given due compensation before the polluters, when the legislation's before the Senate in August.
You're saying this has simply been overlooked, is that right?
I don't think it has been overlooked. I think it's been very easy for the government to ignore it and say, oh, well, that'll be a stoush with the states. And it's taken the Australia Institute to study this and bring it into the light of public discussion. Fortunately, 2 months before we do get to the Senate, and it will now mean that the states have to take notice, defend their patch, look after their health and education systems, and put the case to Kevin Rudd that they should be in the queue long in front of the coal industry and the big polluters.
All right, on the international efforts to deal with climate change, much is expected from the US President Barack Obama. Only last Friday, an energy bill which includes a form of carbon pollution reduction scheme, American style, was passed through the House of Representatives. How big a step was that, in your view?
Well, it's not big enough to meet the global emergency of climate change, where we're looking at massive disruption to the economy, and the scientists tell us we must be aiming at 25 minimum to 40% reduction. However, it is a 17% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2020 over 2000 levels, Tony. Our government's looking at 5%. And moreover, the American legislation has built into it a very big program of spending on creating green jobs, on cleaning up transport systems, on getting across to the renewable energy and energy saving technologies which we all know are going to be boosting economies, the most modern economies, as they become much greener down the line. So it's moved the United States, which was held back by the Bush administration, way down the line, compared to the Rudd government, which is doing much the same as John Howard would be doing had he held office.
Do you agree with Tim Flannery that the US government has done a better job of compensating or dealing with the agricultural sector in its energy bill in such a way that farmers and the agricultural sector in general are much more likely to be on side with the carbon pollution reduction scheme in the States?
Well, Tony, at least they've addressed it, and I can't give you an answer on that because I haven't seen the detail of a very complicated piece of legislation. But as you know, the government here is leaving agriculture out until 2015. And of course it is a big producer of greenhouse gases, and farmers are worried about how they're going to be able to adjust to a world where we have to tackle massive climate change. New Zealand's way ahead of Australia as well. I just think the government thought it was too hard. But they're going to put these massive multi-billion-dollar compensation out again to the resource extraction industries, and I think it's just going to make it much more difficult to bring into focus the need to get behind farming families, the rural sector and so on. They've been left down the queue again. And I just think it's been a polluter's paradise in Canberra. They've clogged the doors of the ministers of the Rudd government, and they've got all the running. Now, I think the Greens believe that the legislation is fatally flawed because at the outset the targets are too low. But when you move into the legislation itself, it's much more geared to those big corporate interests than it is to the wider public, and that includes the rural sector.